now in Athens, which was one of Hadrian's favorite cities because of his general admiration for things Greek and things Athenian in particular. You're looking down here from the Acropolis with the old Agora, which we visited last quarter to the northwest. The well-preserved temple at the left is the Hephaestion, number 1 in the picture, which was built at about the same time as the Parthenon. Both of these buildings would have already been standing for 500 years by the time of Hadrian's visit. To the east are the remains of the Roman Agora or Forum, bounded on the west by a gate, number 2 in the picture, built in the early 1st century AD, and on the east by the so-called Tower of the Winds, number 3, about which we'll hear and see more in a few minutes. Hadrian had a big library built around a garden courtyard to the north of this, and the colonnaded facade still survives at number 4 in this picture. Here you are down at ground level in the Roman Agora or Forum, looking from west to east toward the Tower of the Winds now in the background. The latter is one of the few things to survive from Athens after about 300 BC or so, which does get into an occasional art history text. It housed a very sophisticated clepsydra or water clock built by a fellow named Andronicus around 100 BC. Here you see it up closer now. At the left, attached to the building itself, is the reservoir which held the water, and at the top are representations of, as it were, the 8 winds. It's an octagonal building. They represent north, northeast, east, and so on. It also had sundials on the outer walls, which allowed it to function sort of like the Athenian equivalent to Big Ben. The clepsydra inside was one of the most accurate timekeeping devices of the ancient world. There was a big article about it some years ago in the National Geographic. Here you can see the facade of the library, the building of which Hadrian commissioned. The Corinthian columns, as I've said, identify this as a Roman building even though it's in Athens. Greek was still a language educated Romans like Hadrian needed to know. Marcus Aurelius, as we'll see, knew Greek well enough to use it for his meditations. Hadrian also ordered the Temple of Olympian Zeus to be completed. This is something that had been worked on and off in Athens since the 6th century BC, and it had never been finished. Such was the power of Rome, however, that the emperor could say, "Fiat templum," and there it is. It was the largest temple ever erected in Greece and had 104 60-foot-high columns, several of which, as you can see, still stand. Here it is up closer. The marble used is said to have a high iron content, which accounts for the orange color. The columns are, in effect, rusting. With its roof, it was about 100 feet high, over twice the height of the Parthenon. There's an interesting statue of Hadrian still in the old Athenian Agora, which displays Athena standing on the back of the she-wolf nursing Romulus and Remus. It's not clear what the exact point of the representation on the breastplate is, but it suggests perhaps that Rome is supporting Athenian civilization, or that Athens is actually superior to Rome in culture. Hadrian also visited Ephesus, which had replaced Pergamum as the capital of the Roman province of Asia in Augustus's day, and he would have seen the colossal Temple of Artemis there, which is entirely gone, its location indicated only by this reconstructed column now being used for a stork's nest. Sic transit Gloria Dei. In this picture, you're in Ephesus looking back from the theater now toward the harbor. As at Ostia, the harbor here required constant maintenance, and when this began to be neglected, nature took its course. And the Aegean is now more than a mile beyond the end of the Arcadian Way there, which once ended at the docks. It was in a somewhat earlier version of this theater that the opponents of St. Paul assembled about a century before Hadrian's visit to praise Artemis, the Roman Diana, and chant, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." The victory of the Christians was to become complete, however, to which the stork we saw earlier can attest. Ephesus was soon to become one of the most important Christian centers in Asia Minor, and we'll hear more about it in this regard next time. The Street of the Curates, which you see now, is one of the main thoroughfares through the city and leads past the small Temple of Hadrian, which we'll see up close in a minute, to the Library of Celsus, which, since the re-erection of its facade some years ago, has become one of the most familiar monuments in the classical world. Here's the Library of Celsus up close now. This library wasn't as large as its predecessor at Pergamum, but it did contain 12,000 scrolls and one skeleton. Celsus was the Roman governor here back in Trajan's day, before Hadrian's arrival. And the son of Celsus built this library in honor of his father and had his body buried in it. Amazingly enough, the body was found still in its sarcophagus during the reconstruction project in the middle of the 20th century. I should mention also that from an architectural perspective, the complexity of this facade is often like the Hadrianic Arch associated with Roman building in the 2nd century AD. Here's the small Temple of Hadrian back up the street with the typical Hadrianic Arch over the entrance. Hadrian and most of the other emperors with any sense did not, of course, think that when they were given the title Divus, or God, they automatically acquired any supernatural power. Here's the entrance closer up. Still, to disregard or refuse to acknowledge this title, or the primacy of the Roman divinities in general, was tantamount to treason, and this did get a lot of Jews and Christians in trouble. When Hadrian proposed to erect a shrine in honor of Jupiter on the ruins of the temple in Jerusalem, the rebellion of Bar Kokhba ensued, which resulted in further catastrophe for the Jews there. In spite of Hadrian's generally praiseworthy character, there is a bullheadedness about his attitude toward the Jews that makes some of his admirers uncomfortable. Hadrian also visited Aphrodisias, and you see here the not very well preserved ruins of the baths he ordered built there. It's about 100 miles or so east of Ephesus. Aphrodisias was almost unknown to modern tourists until a big earthquake in 1956 so badly damaged the town that had been built over the ruins that it was decided to just relocate the town altogether and turn the site over to archaeologists. And since then it has become one of the major destinations on Turkish tourist itineraries. It was especially famous in antiquity for its school of sculptors. We know 30 of them by name, which is more than are known from Rome itself, though again we don't know, with just a couple of exceptions, which sculptor did which work. The local museum at Aphrodisias contains many fine works which were discovered after the excavation started, including this example of Achilles fighting with Penthesilea here. She was the queen of the Amazons who attempted to aid the Trojans against the Greeks. One of the favorites in the museum is this portrait of Flavius Palmatus, a local citizen of consequence. I'll bet you thought the afro was a hairstyle that originated in about 1968, but here's the original one. After all, this is Aphrodisias, isn't it? Don't write that down. Actually, the place was named after Aphrodite, and this is the ruin of her temple there. Aphrodite, whom the Romans identified with Venus, held a special place in Roman tradition since she was, again, the mother of Aeneas, considered the founder of Roman civilization. Augustus might have been thinking of that in part when he called Aphrodisias his favorite city in Asia Minor. Like so many such buildings, this was turned into a church in the Middle Ages. The stadium here, which holds about 30,000, is one of the most well-preserved of all such things. It was constructed about 100 AD, and so would have been brand new at the time of Hadrian's visit, around 130 or so, and it is, again, occasionally in use today. A few years ago, a camel race drew a capacity audience here. Hadrian probably also visited Hierapolis, which is only a few miles away. This city grew up near some of the most famous hot springs in the Mediterranean world. At Pamukkale nearby, the water leaves a calcium deposit on the hillside over which it flows that makes it look from a distance as though it's covered with snow. Here you see the main entrance to the city from the north, the Domitian Gateway, built in the 1st century AD. The theater here at Hierapolis, which was built around 200 after Hadrian's day, has, like the theater at Orange, a well-preserved skene decorated with some wonderful ornamentation for which the workshops at nearby Aphrodisias were probably responsible. Epictetus, whose lectures Arrian summarized in the so-called Manual of Epictetus, which was Hadrian's Bible, was born here, though not in residence at Hierapolis at the time of the emperor's visit. Well, while Hadrian was wandering around the world, his tomb was being constructed next to what's now Vatican City, west of the Tiber in Rome. This is another photo of part of that model of the ancient city of Rome in the Museum of Roman Civilization. This tomb was a colossal thing with an artificial mountain on top planted with cypresses. It still survives under the name Castle San Angelo. In the Middle Ages, it was turned into a fortress and was used by the popes in times of civil unrest as a sort of fallout shelter. In around 600 AD, Gregory the Great, the fellow who got Trajan into paradise, saw a vision in which the archangel Michael landed on top of it and sheathed his sword, indicating that a plague, which was then raging in the city, was coming to an end. And that's why it's called the Castle of the Holy Angel, San Angelo. The modern bronze statue of Michael on top of the tomb fortress commemorates this. Antoninus Pius, shown here with his wife Faustina, was the man adopted by Hadrian to succeed him, and he's sometimes regarded as sort of the Calvin Coolidge of the Roman Empire, a sort of dull fellow who ruled Rome for 23 years, during which little that gets into the history books happened. The so-called Augustan history, which is our main source for his reign, says that among the memorable things that took place in the city of Rome during that period were the birth of quintuplets and the appearance of a comet. If those were among the big events, it must have been a pretty good time to be alive. Thomas Carlyle says, "Happy are those people whose pages in history are blank." This reminds me of a headline that once appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle. It read, "Two dog sleds collide in Antarctica." It's a nice day when reporters have to dig that deep to fill up the paper. Antoninus' bad wife Faustina sold political favors, was incurably promiscuous, and was able to deceive her husband about all this to the extent that he had a temple built in her honor in the Forum. It still survives, in part, having been turned into the Christian church of San Lorenzo in Miranda. After Antoninus' death, his successor Marcus Aurelius rededicated the temple to Antoninus as well as Faustina. And in this closer view now, you can see the upper lintel, which was added with his name on it. You can also see that the entrance to the church on the Forum side here has been left high and dry since the excavations in the 19th century. When the church was built, the floor of the Forum was not far below its door sill. The man who succeeded Antoninus Pius was his adopted heir Marcus Aurelius, whom you see here. After 23 years of pacific Antoninus, some of the barbarian tribes to the north and east began to question Roman resolve, and then Antoninus was succeeded by a man, Marcus Aurelius, who by reputation was more scholar than soldier. And this made them even more ambitious, and Marcus Aurelius had to spend much more time convincing them he was a soldier than he would have liked. Instead of spending time in the library of Trajan, he had to spend his time on the battlefields of Austria and northern Italy. Here is a Roman officer's helmet now on display in Munich. Peter Connolly, in his book on classical warfare, says it's in really bad taste, but I doubt that would really hurt the owner's feelings much. I mentioned that Tacitus sort of idealized the barbarian Germans and Britons, but Gibbon has no such illusions about them. Gibbon, in The Decline and Fall, says that the Germans drank to relieve themselves of the pain of thinking and fought to, as he puts it, give themselves a more lively sense of their existence. This was probably, this helmet, taken to Bavaria as a trophy rather than dropped there by its owner, because the Romans did not penetrate very far into Germany for very long at a time, though they did occupy much of Austria. Marcus Aurelius spent a good deal of time in what's now Vienna, and he also died there. Now in a minute we'll see the column of Marcus Aurelius, which commemorates his accomplishments in Rome. But before that, I want to just take a quick look back here at this detail from the column of Trajan, which we saw last time. I always feel a little guilty about starting a class on the Middle Ages all the way back in the 2nd century A.D., but the art historian Roger Hinks says that in art the Middle Ages began between the columns of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, between around 110 and 170 A.D. The column of Trajan, which you see close up here, is decorated with all sorts of different activity and subject matter. There's a certain 3D realism about it, and the workmanship is obviously very refined. Now we'll look ahead to Marcus Aurelius's column of about a half century later. Now the claim is there's much more monotony about the subjects. The figures are just copies of one another, and they're kind of piled up on top of each other, and the sculpture just isn't of the same overall quality. I'm paraphrasing Hinks from memory, but that's at least the kind of thing he says anyway.
But I really don't find his claims very convincing.
Here's the whole Marcus Aurelius column now as it stands in the Piazza Colonna just off the Corso in Rome, just a javelin throw from the column of Trajan. As we've seen, there's perhaps a certain logic to putting St. Peter on Trajan's column, and Will Durant says that Marcus Aurelius's meditations are worthy to be considered the fifth gospel. So maybe St. Paul, who's on top of Marcus Aurelius's column here now, isn't so out of place here either. However, I don't think the meditations are that gospel-like. How do we face death? Marcus Aurelius says, like a good Stoic, as I mentioned earlier, don't worry, in a little while you'll be nobody in no place like Trajan and Hadrian. That's hardly the message of the evangelists. Nor did Marcus Aurelius, I imagine, ever give much thought to selling all he had and giving it to the poor, or loving his neighbor as himself. Not a lot of people calling themselves Christians do that either, of course, but Jesus says they should. This is the famous equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius on top of the Capitoline Hill, where it stood for some 450 years until it was moved inside the Capitoline Museum just a few years ago. It was apparently originally located near St. John Lateran, and in the Middle Ages was mistaken for a statue of Constantine, for which reason it is said the church protected it from destruction. The church tried unsuccessfully to prevent a lot of things from destruction, however, and how this made it unscathed through so many sacks and tumults borders on the miraculous. It's close to being a one-of-a-kind survival. Here's the way it looks inside the museum now. In the marble faun, Hawthorne calls it the most impressive effigy of kingly majesty in the history of art. Ernst Renan calls Marcus Aurelius the best ruler in history, and Herbert Muller calls him the noblest Roman of them all. So even if he didn't write the fifth gospel, he was at least a pretty good man. As a father, however, he was a colossal failure. After a century of sonless emperors, Marcus Aurelius now did have a boy, Commodus. He expected, as the greatest statesman and one of the greatest philosophers alive, to be able to bring up to be a fit heir. Commodus looks nice enough here at maybe the age of 10, but he didn't even turn out to be a fit human being, let alone a fit emperor. If your sons and daughters haven't turned out just the way you wanted them to, you have some illustrious company. Gibbon says that education is seldom of any use except where it's practically superfluous, and he's speaking about Marcus Aurelius's attempt to educate his son Commodus to be a fit successor. Our capacity to mold our children to our ideals is much more limited than a lot of child psychologists would like us to believe. Here's Commodus as a grown man. It is with the reign of Commodus that Gibbon says, in fact, that the decline and fall of the Roman Empire really began. With his reign, we begin the century of the bad emperors, really, following the century of the good ones that ended with his father. From Commodus in 180 to the accession of Diocletian in 285, we have about 32 serious claimants for the throne, and 28 of them were assassinated. One of the others was killed in battle, and one was hit by lightning. 2 apparently died of natural causes. Commodus did have a Christian mistress. I guess that's the good news. But the bad news is, as far as he's concerned anyway, that she poisoned him. There was no need for term limit legislation in the 3rd century AD. After the death of Commodus, there was chaos for a year or so, during which the army garrison stationed in Rome, the Praetorian Guard, attempted to actually auction off the Roman Empire to the highest bidder. Septimius Severus here arrived with his army, however, to restore something like order. The decline and fall of the empire isn't just a straight downhill slide. Even in the bad 3rd century, there were capable people, and Septimius Severus was one of those. Also, despite spending most of his life on military campaigns and all of it in danger, he's one of the 2 emperors in the century to die in bed. Septimius Severus's wife, Julia Domna here, was one of the more interesting women of the era. There never was an empress regnant in Rome, but there were certainly a lot of powerful women in the imperial families. Gibbon says Julia was a patroness of every art and a friend to every man of genius, and possessed a firmness of mind and strength of judgment seldom bestowed on her sex, or on the other sex either for that matter. This is the Arch of Septimius Severus, which has always been, since it was built, one of the most conspicuous things in the Forum Romanum. It was the largest such arch that had been erected, and the first to have 3 apertures. You may remember the Piranesi engraving, which shows the level of the forum almost at the height of the lower arches. In the Middle Ages, the goat-herding descendants of the Caesars turned the thing into a 3-room house by boarding up the openings. Septimius Severus died at York in Britain and said some memorable last words. He said, "I've been everything and it's worth nothing." The arch was dedicated to Septimius Severus and his sons, Gaeta and Caracalla, but if you could see it well enough, you'd notice that the dedication to Gaeta has been chiseled out. Septimius had been critical of Marcus Aurelius for trying to raise the worthless Commodus to be a fit emperor, but like most fathers, he felt he could do better, but he didn't. After his death, one of his sons, Caracalla, murdered the other, Gaeta, and tried to rule the whole empire by himself. In this sort of family portrait, a rare painted panel to survive from the 3rd century, you can see Septimius Severus and Julia Domna. You can probably recognize them from the sculpted portraits we've seen, with Caracalla and the blank space where Gaeta used to be. But as I said, he was literally and figuratively rubbed out of the family. Here, Caracalla looks sort of like a wild man, and Gibbon calls him simply the common enemy of all mankind. Septimius said that the key to success was making the soldiers happy, and Caracalla did take that seriously, however, and was successful at it for a while. And Caracalla also built the biggest baths yet put up in Rome, which made his subjects there happy, again for a while. These are still used in a manner of speaking. This is where the original Three Tenors concert was held, with the north side of the baths as a backdrop back in 1990. I mentioned that Juvenal says that what the Romans really wanted was bread and circuses, but he could have said bread and baths. Baths are probably even more representative of Roman architecture than amphitheaters. To call them baths is to give somewhat the wrong impression of them, though, because although they did have swimming pools, they were really more what we would think of now as Turkish baths. They also often included libraries, restaurants of a sort, exercise rooms. There's really nothing today that's quite like them. Gibbon says that for a few cents, the poorest Roman could spend all day here in a setting that would have been the envy of the king of Persia. And since a large part of the population was essentially unemployed and dependent on things like public distribution of grain, these may at times have functioned almost like homeless shelters. There were around 80 public baths of various sizes in Rome by the 4th century. Some sources put the number even higher, plus lots of swimming pools of a more modern sort. Even the working class could make use of them because the workday allowed for a long mid-afternoon break, something, of course, that still influences Mediterranean business hours to this day.
The baths of Caracalla were decorated with some now famous works of Roman sculpture, although they are apparently copies of earlier Greek works, which I don't think really distracts from their impressiveness. This is called the Farnese Bull. What's going on here is hard to explain quickly, but the essence of it is that the two men are tying the woman to the bull to punish her for mistreating their mother. Despite the size and complexity of the work, it was apparently, amazingly, carved from a single block of marble. The Farnese Hercules was also found in the ruins of the baths, and like the bull is now in the Museo Archeologico in Naples.
Caracalla was finally assassinated by some of his soldiers he hadn't made happy enough long enough, and was succeeded by a fellow known as Elagabalus or Heliogabalus. You see Elagabalus here now. He was passed off as Caracalla's illegitimate son, but he may have been his grandnephew or some other more or less distant relative. In any case, he was only 14 at his accession and was assassinated himself at 19. He was succeeded by another boy, Alexander Severus, who was perhaps his cousin, who's a little more interesting because the great Christian thinker Origen was his tutor, and he is said, Alexander Severus, to have worshipped before a shrine containing statues of Jesus, Moses, and Jupiter. Like Commodus, who had a Christian mistress, Alexander Severus obviously tolerated some Christians, even if he made no move to officially legalize the faith.
It would be 100 years before Constantine would do that, but several other emperors, if not all, before him were also what can be called tolerant. Alexander Severus is said to have made the site where Santa Maria in Trastevere was built in Rome available for Christian use, and the church there now is one of the oldest in the city.
After his death, the empire reached one of its low points in a century marked by many, when the Emperor Valerian was captured in 260 by Shapur, the king of Persia, an episode commemorated here in Nakhchi-Rustam near Persepolis in modern Iran. If Trajan or Hadrian had been so captured, this would have been regarded as a national calamity. But not so with Valerian. The bad news is that he was captured. The good news is that no one in Rome really noticed he was missing, except his son Gallienus, who was glad he was gone and became the new emperor for a few years of self-indulgence until he was also assassinated. In 270, Aurelian made good his claim to rule as emperor with the backing of his army. There's a sort of democratic quality to the empire in the 3rd century. Most of those who ruled did so not because they were the son of the preceding emperor, but simply because they had the backing, the votes, as it were, of the men who counted, the soldiers. And as frequently happens in democracies, the electorate often tired very quickly of its choice, and he was then killed, which was more or less the 3rd century equivalent to being voted out of office. Aurelian lasted only 5 years, but that's longer than most presidents. Aurelian was known as Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, and his motto was Manus ad ferrum, my hand on my sword. Gibbon says his punishments were harsh, but that he seldom had to punish the same criminal twice. He was a believer in the one-strike law. The main accomplishment for which he is remembered is the wall named for him and which was built in just 5 years. Originally, it was 12 miles long, and about 9 miles of it still stands. It's seen at its best here on the south, where it still essentially separates the city from the country. It was the first extensive refortification of the city in some 600 years, and impressive as it is, the very fact that it was thought necessary indicates that Rome was no longer what it was. Here's the Porta San Sebastiano on the south side of the city, where the Appian Way begins now. There is some controversy about whether or not to widen some of these remaining ancient gates. Some, of course, have been completely obliterated already, but preservationists are trying to save those that still remain in the face of more and more traffic that makes them worse and worse bottlenecks. On the north side of the city, the wall has been pierced to allow for more traffic, while the old gate, here the Porta Pinciana, has been retained. This is the gate that leads to the Via Veneto, once one of the most fashionable streets in Rome. Well, in 275, Aurelian himself was assassinated. As Gibbon puts it, no matter what the merit of the emperors, their ends were commonly the same. And his next 11 successors were all assassinated as well, before Diocletian arrived on the scene to temporarily stabilize and forever change the Roman Empire. So that's where we'll begin next week. And we'll also hear about Constantine and the legalization of Christianity, see the oldest surviving copies of the New Testament, hear the oldest surviving Christian music, see the oldest surviving great churches in Rome, and face the barbarian perils of the 5th century.